listener production.
Hey, it's Helen Smith here with The Briefing. A Sydney man has been found not guilty of having non-consensual sex with a woman, with his defence being sexsomnia. So what is it? Sexsomnia is a sleep disorder that causes people to engage in sexual behaviours in their sleep, such as dirty talk, masturbation, and even intercourse. However, conducting studies on sexsomnia can be really difficult because most people have no memory of their actions and only become aware from a partner or after injuring themselves, as it most commonly occurs during the deepest stages of sleep. Sexsomnia is listed in the DSM, basically the Bible of psychological disorders, and it is a scientifically recognised condition. But unsurprisingly, sexsomnia is pretty controversial when it's used as a defence in cases of sexual assault and consent. And currently, there are no laws, rules, or regulations about having sexsomnia or your actions because of it, which was highlighted in the most recent case in Sydney. Last year in May, I spoke with Dr Cunnington, a specialist sleep physician, and also Aleks Trkulja, a therapist at the Pleasure Centre. Here's that ep again, as sexsomnia is being used as a defence in more sexual assault cases. Firstly, Dr Cunnington, thanks for joining us on The Briefing. Is sexsomnia real?
It absolutely is a thing. So there's a group of disorders called non-REM parasomnias, and think of that as automatic behaviours that can occur during sleep. Sleep talking, sleep eating, sleep walking, and sexsomnia or sleep sex is another version of those non-REM parasomnias.
So how common is sexsomnia? Because I've heard about insomnia, I've heard about sleepwalking, sleep talking, but I feel like we don't really talk or hear much about sexsomnia.
So it's actually reasonably common, not as common as sleep talking, but more common often than what people will think about, because it's not the sort of thing people talk about really. It's a pretty private thing, and sometimes people only talk about it if it's causing problems in a relationship or problems between a couple. Is often when people might go and see their healthcare professional, or they might end up in my office as a specialist sleep physician who's working in this area. Around 2 in 100 adults have some form of non-REM parasomnia, and a reasonable proportion of those at some time will have sexualised behaviours or sexsomnia as part of those non-REM parasomnias.
Then could I be experiencing sexsomnia and not realise it?
Absolutely. So that's one of the characteristics of non-REM parasomnias generally, is the person who's having those behaviours has very little recollection, or in fact often no recollection of what's gone on. And in the case of sexsomnia, it's the partner that says, hey, this happened, and it often leads to pretty challenging discussions the next day, particularly as the person who's doing it doesn't recall that. And it's definitely not a conscious behaviour. These things occur in a deep stage of sleep, generally stage 3, non-REM sleep, what we used to call slow wave sleep. And it's the type of sleep where people, 1, don't have control over what they're doing, and 2, have no recollection of what's been happening.
So is sexsomnia always intercourse? Tell me about some of the different behaviours it's classified as.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not always intercourse. As we know, there's a whole range of different sexualised behaviours. And so sexsomnia can take any of those forms. I say a whole range of behaviours, which can just be cuddling, it can be kissing, it can be fondling, it can be rubbing up against someone, it can be, anything up to and including intercourse.
Are there any misconceptions about the condition?
So a common misconception, not just for sexsomnia, but for all of the non-REM parasomnias, is that it's the true person coming out in sleep. You've been able to hide the fact while you're awake that you're really just a very aggressive, nasty type of person, and now you're asleep. Your true feelings for me are coming out, and you really are shouting at me, swearing at me, trying to hit me, try to have sexual intercourse or sexualised behaviours with me, and there's your true personality that's come out. Now, that has its origins in some Freudian sort of teachings or Freudian ways of conceptualising some of these behaviours, but in fact that's totally false. These behaviours have no link to our waking personality. And in fact, what's happening biologically is the cortex and what's called the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that's got our values, our sort of what we stand for, our personality. In these behaviours, that part of the brain is offline. So your normal sort of value filter you've got these very primitive, raw behaviours. Normally while we're awake, it would run through our values filter and we'd go, no, that's not me. I'm not going to do that. But while we're asleep in a non-REM parasomnia, that filter's offline. So you don't actually get to apply your values to make a judgment of, will I do that behaviour? And it's just that very raw, unfiltered behaviour. And so rather than reflecting someone's true personality and it coming out at night, in fact, their true personality is offline and taken out of it.
Speaking of behaviours, when would sexsomnia start? Would it be the same as when you're going through puberty?
Yeah, it's a very biological behaviour. And much in the same way as, you see animals. My son's into cows and breeding cattle, and we can tell when a cattle's nearing puberty or nearing sexual maturation because sexualised behaviour begins to appear. If you think of it as an automatic behaviour, similarly in humans, sexualised non-REM parasomnias or sexsomnias will generally only begin to appear once sexual behaviours are part of the natural behaviours. So that is after puberty.
Are there any triggers for sexsomnia? So can any lifestyle behaviours increase your chances of having sexsomnia, or is it always part of you?
No, absolutely. So there are definitely things that will make any of the non-REM parasomnias more likely. For a non-REM parasomnia to occur, you've got to have that bulk of the brain asleep. So you've got to be sort of deeply asleep, but you've got to have that fight-flight response of the brain awake. So you've almost got to have the brain sort of doing two separate things at the one time. So things that can create that state are things that are going to make the bulk of the brain sleep more deeply. Think of that as being sleep deprived, being overly sleepy, trying to sleep, very late in the night when you're absolutely exhausted, sedative medications, alcohol, they'll all promote that sort of sleepiness. And then things that increase that alertness, stress is probably the biggest one. Again, sleeping at a time when you wouldn't normally be asleep, so people who do shift work. And so all of those factors will increase the likelihood of having non-REM parasomnias. So it's really common for me to see people who may not have it, but then may have a period of time when life's pretty stressful and they're pretty busy and get a bit sleep deprived, and maybe also take a bit of alcohol to help manage sleep with managing the stress. And there you've got this sort of cluster that all comes together and they start to get non-REM parasomnias. The unfortunate bit is once someone starts to get non-REM parasomnias, particularly sexsomnia, you don't want it to happen. So you're almost trying to sleep with one ear open to self-monitor to try and prevent it happening. And that's exactly the type of sleep where it is going to happen more. So once it starts to happen and you start to be anxious about it happening, it almost guarantees it's going to happen more, and it's a vicious cycle.
Now let's hear from Aleks Trkulja, an individual and couples therapist at the Pleasure Centre. Aleks, so how do we bring consent into the conversation?
That's a good question. I guess perhaps they're starting to talk about it more because discourse around consent and safe sex is a really big topic at the moment. And obviously consent can be a really big issue with sexsomnia if there's potential assault happening during an episode. So perhaps it's also becoming a larger conversation of people experiencing assault by a partner, but it's a sexsomnic episode.
Yeah, so on the back of that, people charged with sexual assault have used sexsomnia as a defence. Would you be able to talk us through some of the complexities there?
Look, I think in our justice system, we can use mental health conditions and some other conditions in order to excuse certain behaviours. That is complex in itself because it's not as simple as it being a bit of a blanket approach. I think sexual assault is really nuanced, and ultimately the complexity around sexsomnia is that if you're unconscious and assaulting someone, it is different to being conscious and intentionally assaulting someone, but we also have to look at the safety of victim survivors of assault and recognize that it is technically unwanted touch. It is sexual assault and or rape in some of these situations, which makes it really complex.
You touched on consent before. Is there any way to maintain consent when you have sexsomnia?
I don't know that you can maintain consent if you're unconscious and you're not actually conscious to receive consent from the person you're touching. I think in order for consent to happen, you both need to be, or two or more people need to be conscious and fully aware of what's about to happen. Because even if you were to establish consent with a long-term partner, let's say around like, oh, if this were to happen tonight, like, just know, like, what if they change their minds in between that conversation and touch being initiated? A very important part of consent is that it can be updated. I don't think it's as simple as blanket consent, because blanket consent around things like kissing a long-term romantic partner, people go, yeah, sure, I'm happy for them to come give me a kiss. I don't need to give consent every time. But with sexsomnia, we don't know necessarily what kind of sexual behavior could occur. So it's not as simple as a blanket consent of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. So if somebody has sexsomnia or might think they have sexsomnia, what's a good way to find support?
I think that the first place you can go is a GP to discuss any symptoms you're noticing or any observations a partner has had about your behavior during sleep, and to know that it is a condition and it can be managed. A GP will likely connect you with a sleep specialist that can then help you to address the underlying triggers for sexsomnia.
That was Aleks Trkulja from the Pleasure Centre and specialist sleep physician Dr David Cunnington. Thanks for listening. That's it for this episode. But before you go, if you liked this ep, we'd love it if you could share it with someone else you think might enjoy it too. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Insta at The Briefing Podcast or on TikTok and YouTube. Just search for Listener Newsroom. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.